Well, in 1961, Pontiac introduced one of the most unique cars in automotive history, certainly its history, and that was the 1961 Pontiac Tempest that you see here. The Tempest was actually a pretty good looker when it was introduced in that 1961 model year, and the front end was patterned quite distinctly off of the 1959 wide-track Pontiacs that had that split grille theme. And you'll notice that in 1960, the full-size Pontiacs, as you can see here, didn't have that split grille theme. They would return to it in 61, but the Tempest would really copy that 59 front end and do so, I think, quite handsomely. It had that styling, and despite the fact that these senior compacts from Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac shared front doors, glass, roof panels, they all seemingly look quite different. And I think the door is actually an interesting piece that they all had to share because there's some pretty distinct feature lines on it, and yet Buick and Olds came up with styling that was quite different from the Tempest, and the cars were quite successful overall. As I mentioned, these cars were so-called senior compacts. They were a little bit larger than the Corvair that was introduced for the 1960 model year, and hence the name. They also employed some of the Corvair components, but the Tempest, I would really say, was probably the most unique of the three. And we're going to talk about, in particular, the Tempest drivetrain, because it was so unconventional for the time, even for today, far beyond the Buick and Oldsmobile powertrains. And, the Corvair powertrain, let's say, was unconventional for General Motors, being an air-cooled flat six-cylinder that was placed in the rear of the vehicle. But that was something that other automakers were doing at that time, namely Porsche, VW, etc. What was not really done very typically was having a front engine, rear transaxle car like the Pontiac Tempest. And in particular, the Tempest had this unconventionally conventional four-cylinder engine, half of a 389, literally half of a 389 engine up front is the standard engine. And then it had a transmission and the transaxle out back in the rear. So as opposed to having the transmission right behind the engine, as was the case in the Olds and the Buick, the Tempest actually had the transmission out in the rear. And the engine torque was transmitted through a so-called rope drive shaft. Let's talk about this a little bit more because it's, again, super unconventional, especially for the time. And, I would say even a little bit today. There are some cars that do have this rear-mounted transaxle today, but mostly sports cars. This was a just standard old run-of-the-mill senior compact. Again, let's get into some of the more details. First of all, let's talk about the objectives of the Tempest. What was Pontiac trying to achieve with this particular senior compact car? Well, the first was that it wanted to provide full-size six-passenger comfort with adequate luggage space to customers. So not a four-place, five-place car. This was going to be a full six-passenger car. They also wanted to provide good fuel economy and good performance. So they didn't want something that was going to have the performance of, say, a VW Beetle and take over 20 seconds to go from 0 to 60. They wanted something that actually had decent performance. Number three, they wanted something that was going to ride and handle like a larger car. It wasn't going to be something that was super rough riding, unrefined. They wanted it to have good ride and handling. Number four, wanted to obviously be good value for the price in its class. This was, after all, a senior compact, and senior compacts were typically procured by individuals who were cost conscious. And number five, they wanted it to have clean styling that was distinctively Pontiac, but also would appeal to many customers. So those were the overall goals for the Tempest. And one of the things that you can see in this diagram is that the Tempest was significantly smaller on the outside versus the Catalina of the era. The overall length of the Tempest was 189.3 inches. The Catalina was 210 inches. So a significant difference in size, also in width. The Catalina was 78.2 inches wide. The Tempest was 72.2 inches wide. And the wheelbase was also shorter, as you can imagine, given the overall length, 112 inches versus 119 inches for the Catalina. So you're trying to fit six passengers in here in a car that has overall much more tidy dimensions. how do you do that without significantly impinging upon the overall dimensions of the interior? And before we get into that, I will say that in general, the Tempest did compare quite favorably in a number of respects to the larger car. In particular, front seat legroom in the Tempest was about 44.1 inches. In the full-size Pontiac, it was 45.3. So about an inch less in front seat leg room. And then in the rear seat leg room, 37.8 inches for the Tempest, 40.4 in the full-size Pontiac. So still pretty roomy overall. And the amazing thing about the Tempest, I would say, is that the luggage capacity, it could fit 27.5 cubic feet of cargo. Now, just to put this into perspective, the average sedan, I would say today, mid-size sedan, say Chevrolet Malibu, kind of Toyota Camry-esque, has about 15, 16 cubic feet of trunk capacity. This car had 27.5. It could fit all of the boxes and the golf clubs that you see here in the trunk of the car. And it seems like that's a mistake, but it's not. I've seen the trunk in these cars, and it is actually huge. It's quite an engineering feat, I would say, for the car. So the Tempest was successful in that regard. The other thing that really helped the Tempest was the rear-mounted transaxle. That endowed the car with a significant amount of floor space in the front and a significantly reduced transmission hump in the center area of the vehicle because, well, there wasn't a transmission there. It just had to have enough space for the torque tube with the rope drive shaft to pass by. And as you can see in the photo here, there's considerably more room in the Tempest. And, well, the middle passenger up front didn't have to straddle this big transmission hump as they would in a typical compact or even a full-size car. So that was one of the advantages that the Tempest had over other compacts of the era, was that it did have more roominess on the inside, in part due to its unconventional powertrain. And now we get to the fun stuff, the actual underhood and under the body components of the Tempest. And this is where it gets really interesting. First, let's just talk a little bit about the engine underhood, the standard engine. The optional engine in the Tempest was a 215 cubic inch aluminum block V8. There was a standard engine in the Olds F85, as well as the Buick Special. And that engine was actually an engine that, number one, would be sold to Rover and become the Rover V8 in short order and go on to a very long life for Rover and be a successful engine for them. It also would serve as the basis for the Buick V6 that would be introduced, the Fireball V6 in 1962, which would later, after significant evolutions, become the famous Buick 3800. So there was at least that engine, and that was, again, the upper end of the Tempest engine lineup. The standard engine, though, was a four-cylinder engine that was literally half of a 389 V8 with only the passenger bank of cylinders. The driver's side bank was just vacant, and I guess it made a good place for the starter and the generator at the time, but it otherwise was vacant. So here you have a 195 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, a tremendously large four-cylinder engine with no balance shaft. So you can imagine the vibrations in this engine were relatively significant because, again, it had no balance shaft. But it was relatively proven and reliable because it was half of a Pontiac 389 V8. It used the same pistons, valve train, I believe even the same cylinder heads as the 389. So it had quite a bit of, let's say, shared components. In fact, the four-cylinder blocks actually ran down the exact same machining line as the 389 cubic inch V8 with the same tooling in the machining line. And it was a very economical way for Pontiac to come up with a, well, let's call it unconventional, conventional, or conventionally unconventional, I think sounds better, or unconventionally conventional. I don't know. You let me know. But it was basically a rather strange power plant, but one that was relatively reliable. I would say the only thing that was, in terms of the engine, that was an Achilles heel on this engine was the timing chain. And I think part of the issue here was that Pontiac didn't necessarily fully understand the vibrations that the four-cylinder engine would cause, And then that would sometimes cause the timing chain to skip a tooth, particularly as it aged. They did come up with some aftermarket hardware that solved that problem, but I do know that that was one issue that these engines had, particularly if you kept your engine in a poor state of tune and it was shaking around because it wasn't firing on all cylinders as it should. And also interestingly, the Tempest had a whole range of horsepower ratings when it came to that four-cylinder. At the low end, 110 horsepower, single barrel carburetor, regular fuel, four-cylinder engine for the manual transmission cars. And at the upper end, you get 155 horsepower premium fuel, four-barrel carburetor, four-cylinder engine. That would be pretty sweet. Unfortunately, the take rate on that engine was very rare. I believe 1,000, 1,100-ish were made, and that's it. It represented less than 2% of the overall production run. And just for reference, the V8 engine, the optional V8, had a higher take rate at about 3 to 4% of the production run versus the 1 to 2% of the four-barrel 155 horsepower engine. So if you find one of those stock, it is super, super rare. But turning now to the rope drive shaft and the overall transaxle setup, take a look here at this photo. And I think one of the things that's really cool about it is you can see the cross-section of the car. You notice that the engine is kind of installed at an angle, and the drive shaft has a curvature to it, and then you have the transaxle out back with the torque converter exposed to the elements, just open right there. Now, the drive shaft, as I mentioned, was purposefully curved, and one of the reasons for this, you can think of it as effectively a torsion bar. It was not totally, let's say, rigid in torsion, and the reason for that was it could absorb some of the engine shocks. Now, the overall rope drive shaft was relatively thin, and that's because it only had to transmit engine torque, whereas a normal drive shaft that's used in a car has to not only transmit the engine torque, but remember that torque converters are multiplying the torque that the engine is creating. And so drive shafts have to be larger in order to be able to take that. Well, here you didn't have that. The torque converter's out in the rear, so you just have to have the drive shaft be able to take the engine torque. As a result, this so-called rope drive shaft, and that's really a misnomer. It wasn't a rope drive shaft. As I mentioned, it's effectively a torsion bar, but it was only 0.65 inches in diameter in automatic transmission models. I believe it was slightly thicker, maybe 3/4 of an inch in the manual transmission models, because presumably you'd have to take more stress in those cases. But overall, it's a very, very thin design, and it's amazing that it was relatively effective. And as I said, because of its design, it was actually helping to dampen some of the engine vibrations, which when coupled with the very soft engine mounts, helped this oversized four-cylinder be, well, let's just say relatively tame compared to what it could have been. I don't think anybody would have called it smooth. And one of the issues, too, with that rope drive shaft was that as opposed to a typical automatic transmission or manual transmission car, when you're stopped and you're just in neutral with the clutch out, that drive shaft is still spinning. It's only when you press the clutch on the manual transmission cars that it disengages, and in the automatics, if you're in neutral or drive, it's always spinning. It doesn't matter. So you always have this faint kind of whining noise in the car, at least on the automatic transmissions, all the time, and the manual transmission cars whenever the clutch is out. And that's a strange sound and feeling. It's just something that people aren't used to, but it's typical, and that's because of this setup. Now, you can see that the rear suspension on the Tempest was also kind of derived from the Corvair, and it had this swing arm independent rear suspension and consequently had the pros and cons associated with it. Of course, Ralph Nader made his name off of Unsafe at Any Speed, the book that really criticized the Corvair for its rear suspension design, but it was a pretty typical rear suspension design on cars at that time. And, you know, overall, I think for any car of the era, you want to be careful driving it, but these cars do have, if you have a Corvair, a lot more weight distribution in the rear. If you have a Tempest, obviously the engine's up front, so it doesn't have quite as much tendency to oversteer. And I think that was the problem with the Corvair, is that it was a little twitchy at high speeds, given all of the weight that was in the rear with the engine as well as the transmission. The Tempest mitigated some of that by having the engine up front. Regardless, the so-called Tempest torque automatic transmission in particular was just very strange in that the torque converter was air-cooled. That's really the principal reason for why it's exposed to the elements. And it also is out rear and was driven by that torsion bar drive shaft. The torque converter was actually an off-the-shelf 10-inch unit that General Motors used. And one of the great things about this was in high speed, there was a partial mechanical connection between the wheels as well as the transmission. So the cars actually did get good fuel economy, about a gain of 1 mile per gallon at a constant 55 miles per hour, owing to this particular design. So that did work, although the Tempest Torque Automatic was not an especially reliable unit. I think that was something that a number of individuals had challenges with in terms of the reliability. In any case, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the 61 to 63 Tempest and its unusual drivetrain. If you'd like me to discuss an unusual drivetrain in a vehicle, put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.